cover now!
Man your stations! Move it!
They hit the air into those!
Away! Clear the deck! We're launching number 1!
Next flight for launch. Steady as she goes.
For more than a century, the United States believed one machine could dominate the oceans forever. A floating city of steel. A moving airbase capable of crushing nations from thousands of miles away. The aircraft carrier became the ultimate symbol of American military power, feared by enemies, admired by allies, and defended at almost any cost. But behind that image lies a story most people have never heard. Because the history of every American aircraft carrier ever built is not just a story of military engineering. It is a story of desperation, near disasters, experimental failures. Cold War panic, nuclear fear, and weapons so powerful they permanently changed how wars are fought. Some carriers were born from burning wreckage. Others were built because America feared it was losing control of the Pacific. And one terrifying moment during the Cold War nearly convinced the Pentagon that the aircraft carrier itself had become obsolete. What happened next triggered one of the largest naval expansions in human history. Because the truth is, every American supercarrier floating today exists for one reason. The U.S. Navy believes the next World War could begin at sea. And if that happens, aircraft carriers will either save American power or become the largest targets ever created. This story begins long before nuclear carriers, long before jet fighters, long before the massive supercarriers we know today. It begins with a wooden ship, an experiment, and an idea almost everyone thought was ridiculous. In the early 1900s, battleships ruled the oceans. Massive steel giants armed with enormous guns were considered untouchable. Naval power was measured by armor thickness and cannon size. Whoever possessed the largest battleship fleet controlled the seas. Then aviation appeared. At first, military leaders laughed at the idea that tiny fragile aircraft could threaten warships. Many admirals believed airplanes were little more than reconnaissance toys. But one country saw potential. The United States Navy began experimenting with launching aircraft from ships during World War I. In 1922, America commissioned its very first aircraft carrier, USS Langley. And it looked nothing like the carriers of today. Originally built as a coal ship, Langley was converted into a flat-deck experimental vessel. It was slow, awkward, and primitive. Pilots landed on wooden decks with almost no safety systems. Crashes were common. Fires were constant threats. But hidden inside this strange ship was a terrifying realization. Aircraft could attack targets hundreds of miles away, far beyond the range of battleship guns. That single discovery would eventually destroy centuries of naval doctrine. What happened next shocked naval strategists across the world. America soon built larger carriers, USS Lexington and USS Saratoga. These ships were enormous for their time. Converted from unfinished battlecruisers, they represented the Navy's first serious commitment to carrier warfare. And suddenly, the aircraft carrier was no longer an experiment. It was becoming the future. Yet even then, many military leaders still refused to believe carriers could dominate major wars. That illusion died in flames during World War II. When Japan attacked on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. battleship fleet was devastated. But by pure coincidence, America's aircraft carriers were not in port. That accident changed history forever. Because the surviving carriers became the only major offensive weapon America had left in the Pacific. The Navy immediately pushed its carriers into battle. And suddenly, the world witnessed something terrifying. Aircraft launched from carriers could destroy fleets before enemy ships even saw each other. The Battle of the Coral Sea became the first naval battle in history where opposing fleets never directly fired at one another. Aircraft did everything. Then came Midway. And what happened there permanently changed naval warfare. In just hours, American carrier aircraft destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, crippling Japan's naval power. The age of the battleship ended. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun. But victory came with a horrifying cost. American carriers became priority targets. Pilots faced suicide attacks, submarines hunted task forces relentlessly, and the Pacific Ocean turned into a graveyard of steel. The U.S. Navy responded by building carriers at an unprecedented speed. The most famous were the Essex-class carriers. More than 20 Essex-class ships were constructed during the war. They became the backbone of American naval aviation. And they were terrifying. These carriers projected overwhelming air power across the Pacific. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes launched wave after wave of attacks against Japanese forces. But there was another reason the Essex-class became legendary. They proved America could mass-produce naval supremacy. No nation on Earth could match the industrial power of the United States. And 2 minutes into this war story, the stakes became clear. Because aircraft carriers were no longer just ships. They had become moving military empires. If you're fascinated by military strategy, naval warfare, and the hidden history behind America's most powerful weapons, make sure to subscribe and stay watching, because the most dangerous carrier America ever built appears later in this story, and it nearly triggered a global crisis. As World War II intensified, carrier design evolved rapidly. America built light carriers, escort carriers, and fleet carriers. Some escorted convoys against submarines. Others supported amphibious invasions across the Pacific. Escort carriers were smaller and slower, but they played a critical role hunting German U-boats in the Atlantic. Meanwhile, massive fleet carriers carried the main striking force of the Navy. And by the end of the war, one fact had become undeniable. Whoever controlled aircraft carriers controlled the oceans. But then a new threat appeared. Nuclear weapons. After World War II, military planners feared future wars would involve atomic bombs. Suddenly, carriers needed to launch heavier aircraft capable of delivering nuclear payloads. That fear led to the creation of bigger and more advanced ships. The Midway-class carriers emerged as transitional giants between World War II carriers and modern supercarriers. These ships were heavily armored and designed for the nuclear age. They served through multiple wars and remained operational for decades. But something else was happening behind the scenes. Jet aircraft were arriving. And early jet fighters created a nightmare for carrier operations. Jets were faster, heavier, and required longer runways. Many experts feared carriers simply could not adapt. For a moment, it looked like the aircraft carrier era might end. Then British engineers developed angled flight decks and steam catapults. The United States quickly adopted these innovations. That decision saved the carrier. Suddenly, carriers could launch and recover jet aircraft far more efficiently. And the result was revolutionary. The U.S. Navy began constructing the first true supercarriers. The Forrestal-class carriers arrived during the 1950s. These ships were enormous compared to earlier carriers. They carried advanced radar systems, massive air wings, and enough firepower to project American influence across entire regions. But hidden beneath the massive flight decks was something even more important. Strategy. The carrier strike group concept emerged. Destroyers, cruisers, submarines, supply ships, and airborne surveillance aircraft all operated together around the carrier. The aircraft carrier was no longer just a ship. It had become the center of an entire mobile battle network. And during the Cold War, those networks constantly shadowed Soviet forces across the globe. The Soviet Union understood the danger immediately. American carriers allowed the United States to place military power almost anywhere on Earth without relying on foreign bases. That terrified Moscow. So the Soviets developed long-range anti-ship missiles specifically designed to destroy carriers. And suddenly, the U.S. Navy faced an uncomfortable question. Could the aircraft carrier survive a modern missile war? The answer would shape the next generation of carriers forever. In 1961, the United States launched something extraordinary. USS Enterprise. This was the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And it looked like something from the future. Powered by 8 nuclear reactors, Enterprise could travel massive distances without refueling. It symbolized America's technological dominance during the Cold War. But it also revealed something dangerous. Aircraft carriers were becoming unbelievably expensive. And despite their power, they remained vulnerable. During the Vietnam War, carriers launched thousands of combat missions. Jets screamed from flight decks day and night. Bombs hammered targets across Southeast Asia. Yet the war also exposed the brutal risks of carrier operations. In 1967, a catastrophic fire erupted aboard USS Forrestal after an accidental rocket launch triggered explosions across the flight deck. The inferno killed more than 100 sailors. The footage shocked the world. Because people suddenly realized these floating fortresses were also floating bombs. Fuel, ammunition, missiles, and aircraft packed together created enormous danger. But the Navy kept building. Because carriers were still considered essential to American power projection. Then came the Nimitz-class. And everything changed again. USS Nimitz became the lead ship of what many consider the most powerful warship class ever created. The Nimitz-class carriers were colossal nuclear-powered supercarriers capable of carrying around 90 aircraft. They became the centerpiece of American military strategy for decades. These ships participated in conflicts across the globe: the Cold War, the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless military operations most people never even heard about. And every time one arrived near a conflict zone, the message was clear. America was watching. Yet behind that image of dominance, a silent arms race continued. China began studying American carrier warfare intensely. So did Russia. Both nations understood a terrifying truth. Directly matching the US Navy carrier for carrier would be almost impossible. So instead, they searched for ways to destroy carriers cheaply. That effort led to one of the most feared weapons in modern warfare: anti-ship ballistic missiles. Some analysts called them carrier killers. For the first time in decades, serious questions emerged about whether massive supercarriers were becoming too vulnerable to survive near enemy coastlines. And inside the Pentagon, military planners began debating the future. Was the era of the aircraft carrier ending? Or was America about to build something even bigger? The answer arrived with the Gerald R. Ford class. USS Gerald R. Ford. This carrier represented the most advanced naval technology ever placed at sea. Electromagnetic catapults replaced older steam systems. Advanced radar improved detection capabilities. Automation reduced crew requirements. New power systems prepared the ship for future weapons, including possible laser defenses. But there was a problem. The Ford class became one of the most expensive weapons systems ever built. Costs exploded into billions upon billions of dollars. Critics argued carriers had become too expensive and too vulnerable for modern warfare. Supporters disagreed completely. They argued no other platform on Earth could project power with the same flexibility. A carrier could move across oceans without needing permission from foreign governments. It could launch strikes, enforce no-fly zones, support invasions, deliver humanitarian aid, and dominate regional conflicts simultaneously. And despite every prediction of obsolescence, carriers continued operating at the center of American strategy. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this entire story is how aircraft carriers evolved from crude experiments into floating military cities. Early carriers launched fragile propeller planes. Modern carriers launched stealth fighters like the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II. Early radar barely tracked nearby aircraft. Modern carrier strike groups integrate satellites, cyber warfare systems, drones, electronic warfare platforms, and advanced missile defenses. And yet, the basic concept remains unchanged. A mobile airfield at sea. One idea transformed global warfare forever. But there is another side to the story most people never think about. The sailors. Aircraft carriers are not just weapons. They are cities filled with thousands of human beings. Pilots operate under crushing pressure. Flight deck crews work inches from spinning jet engines and live ordnance. Submarine threats, fires, collisions, and combat operations create constant danger. Every launch and landing contains risk. At night, during storms, on pitching decks in hostile waters, mistakes can become fatal within seconds. And despite all the advanced technology, some dangers never disappeared. Aircraft carriers remain among the largest military targets ever constructed. That reality became even more alarming as hypersonic missile technology advanced. China's growing naval power, especially in the Pacific, forced American strategists to rethink carrier operations entirely. Future wars may involve carriers operating from much greater distances while relying on stealth aircraft and unmanned systems. The next generation of carrier warfare may look completely different from the battles of Midway or Vietnam. But the carrier itself remains central. And that brings us to the biggest revelation of all. Every American aircraft carrier ever built tells the story of a different era of fear. Langley represented uncertainty. Lexington and Saratoga represented experimentation. Essex-class carriers represented industrial survival during World War II. Midway-class carriers represented nuclear anxiety. Forrestal represented the jet age. Enterprise represented atomic power dominance. Nimitz represented Cold War global supremacy. Ford-class carriers represent the uncertain future of modern warfare. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the next carrier already exists in secret planning rooms. Because the United States Navy is preparing for wars that may not look anything like the conflicts of the past. Drone swarms. Artificial intelligence. Hypersonic missiles. Electronic warfare capable of blinding entire fleets. The next aircraft carrier may fight enemies humans never directly see. Yet despite all the changes across more than 100 years, one reality never disappeared. Aircraft carriers remain symbols of power unlike anything else on Earth. When a U.S. carrier strike group enters a region, governments react. Militaries reposition forces. Intelligence agencies monitor every movement. Entire geopolitical calculations shift instantly. That level of influence is almost impossible to replicate. Which is why America continues building them despite the cost, despite the risks, despite the growing threats. Because if a global conflict erupts tomorrow, aircraft carriers will almost certainly stand near the center of it. And history suggests something even more chilling. Every time experts predicted the death of the aircraft carrier, the next war proved them wrong. Battleships were supposed to dominate forever. They disappeared. Missiles were supposed to eliminate carriers. The carriers adapted. Submarines threatened carrier groups. New defenses emerged. Now hypersonic weapons and drone warfare are creating another moment of uncertainty. But uncertainty has followed carriers since the beginning. From the wooden deck of USS Langley to the nuclear-powered giants crossing the Pacific today, American aircraft carriers have continuously evolved under pressure from one terrifying question. How do you survive the next war before it even begins? And maybe that is why the aircraft carrier remains so fascinating. Because these ships are more than military hardware. They are physical representations of fear, ambition, technology, and global power. Entire wars have been shaped by them. Entire nations have changed strategy because of them. And somewhere tonight, beneath the darkness of the Pacific Ocean, an American carrier strike group is moving silently through the waves, carrying enough firepower to alter world events within hours. The real question is no longer whether aircraft carriers changed warfare forever. They already did. The real question now is whether the next great naval war will prove these massive floating fortresses are still the kings of the sea, or the largest targets ever created.